Welcome, everyone, to another season of programming here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. We're very grateful. I'm Jeff Polet from the Foundation, and we're very grateful to our partners at the museum for hosting us and all their cooperation in putting together programs like this. Also want to draw your attention to the fact that the museum will be holding a Vice Presidency Conference on September 8th and 9th. And you're highly encouraged to attend. There's going to be some great speakers and great programs there. So please mark that on your calendars as well. It's interesting to me that here we have a hot August night, and we weren't quite sure what kind of attendance we were going to get tonight. But I'm quite impressed by this turnout, and a little curious as to why it is. But I suspect part of the reason why there's a turnout such as this is the two people who are being represented on the stage here tonight by the executive directors of their centers, and that's Presidents Carter and Ford, who demonstrated that you could be a decent, honorable person and still hold the highest office in the land. And I think there's not just simply a nostalgia for the idea of decent, honorable people being president, but a recognition that in some sense our republic requires it. And secondly, they demonstrated a real ability for civic friendship and for personal friendship, even though they were bitter political rivals in the 1976 presidential election. After their presidencies, they became very close friends. I was telling Paige earlier today that my favorite exhibit here in the museum is the funeral, President Ford's funeral, and President Carter's speech at the funeral, which is just profoundly moving. It's a really beautiful speech and just such heartfelt delivery, and in some sense hopeful in its own right. Well, with that, I'd like to introduce our two guests tonight. I'm going to start on my far left there, your far right, with Gleaves Whitney, who is the executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and should be familiar to most of you. And if you look at your flyers, you can see the biographies of both our speakers. And I should point out that this is at best a kind of thumbnail of the sort of accomplishments of both of them. I spent some time in preparation for this Googling Ms. Alexander, and just a staggering list of accomplishments and achievements. Really incredible experiences. Next to Gleaves is Paige Alexander, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Carter Center. And she contacted us a while ago and told us that she'd be in Grand Rapids and would like to get together. And we immediately saw the opportunity and said, well, if we can put her on our stage, we should definitely be putting her on our stage. And we're like, well, late August, will it work? And lo and behold, it has worked. So thank you, Paige, for coming to Grand Rapids, and welcome to the Ford Museum. We're thrilled to have you here. I'd like to begin tonight's panel with just a few comments, and then I'm going to ask questions of Paige and Gleaves, and they'll take it over from there for the most part. It is a concerning political moment, I think most of you know, in our country today. If you look at some of the polling data that we have, a majority of Americans believe that we are already in the middle of a civil war in this country. It's a cold civil war, but it's a civil war nonetheless. A majority of people who had voted to re-elect President Trump in 2020 believe that their state should secede from the country. 41% of Biden voters believe that the country should divide into different parts. So the sort of things that led to the first Civil War, acts of violence, talk of secession, all of this has been renewed once again. A poll done by the Kennedy School at Harvard University established that half of voting age Americans under the age of 30 think that our democracy is failing. Another survey found that 46% of Americans believe a future civil war is likely in this country. 43% feel it's unlikely, and 11% were simply not sure. So almost half of Americans believe some sort of civil war is likely in this country. And I think one of the things that we are dedicated to is to keep that from happening if we possibly can. If you've studied the history of Spain in the 1930s, you'll know how ugly those kinds of civil wars can be. And trust in our institutions are at historic lows. I have a graph here about trust in government to do what is right. It is lower now than it was during the depths of Watergate and Vietnam. It's one of its lowest rates ever since we've been polling such stuff. So failing institutions, concerns about violence, concerns about this 237-year experiment in democracy falling apart seems to be a very big part of the day. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about is the sorts of things we need to pay attention to try to hold this together. And whatever else is the case, a 237-year sustained democracy is quite a remarkable achievement and something we'd like to preserve. So with that, I'm going to begin asking questions of our panelists. And Paige, I'd like to ask you first. One of the things the Carter Center does a lot of is election monitoring. And they've done a lot of it in foreign countries, and sad to say, starting to have to do it in this country. In the wake of the 2020 elections, Americans have become both more aware of and concerned about how we run our elections in this country. What are the sort of difficulties that we face in terms of trying to figure out how we can have elections accepted broadly among the populace?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for being here. I think it might have been a little bit of the food, a little bit of the air conditioning. I promise you from Georgia, we did not bring this hot weather. It's just part of the reality of the world now. But the 2020 elections at the end of the day were the safest, most secure elections the U.S. has seen. Almost every state ends with a paper ballot at the end of the day, but there are other systems in place. That is one of those stories that doesn't get out there because there are other stories that take up space. But when we looked at this, I started at the Carter Center. Gleaves and I started in our positions in the summer of 2020, and I had been living in Amsterdam, so I was like overseas, came to Georgia to take the job. I'm from Atlanta originally, but I landed on June 1st, and if you remember June 1st, 2020, Georgia was the hotbed of COVID. And so I'm landing from Europe that had flattened the curve. I get off the plane, and CDC says, have you been to Iran or China? I thought, I'm surprised that's your question, but okay. And then I drive down the streets in Atlanta. It's the weekend after the murder of George Floyd, so I see the aftermath of the protests. I get to my parents' house, and I see Washington, where I'd lived for 25 years, being tear gassed. And I thought, how am I going to go where the Carter Center goes, 113 different elections in 40 countries, when I think we're going to have an issue in the United States? And so I called President Carter and said, I want to talk about how we do this overseas if we're not willing to hold a mirror to ourselves and figure out if we're doing it right. And so we have now looked at what are some of the similarities overseas that we need to think about in the U.S. How do we build trust back in the election process? We do independent observing and monitoring in 40 different countries, different elections. We're doing it today in Zimbabwe as we speak. We've got 98 observers looking at the elections in Zimbabwe. So fast forward 2020 and now 2022, we did it in Georgia, Arizona, a little bit here in Michigan, North Carolina. We're actually starting to look at this at home because I think it's important that independent, nonpartisan observation. It's easy to walk into a foreign country with a Carter Center shirt on and people are like, oh, the internationals are here. But when you walk into Georgia with a Carter Center shirt on, it kind of says something very, very particular, and especially because we wore blue, which we should not have worn blue. I didn't realize that the color had been usurped. While I was living in Europe, apparently you can't wear blue or red unless you're, So doing this in a nonpartisan way is one of the reasons why we want to have conversations, so bipartisan and nonpartisan, to say, how can we build back trust in an election process so people feel that when they're casting their vote, it's being counted. There are no little men in the machine changing the votes, that it's being counted appropriately. And so that's one of the ways that, from 2020 moving forward, we've started looking at how do we build back that trust.
So difficult to do. Yeah.
It is.
Like,
it is.
like how do you build back that trust?
Well, I think shining a light on things is always the best way to do it. And so if you're able to say this, I had forgotten when I went in Georgia and I voted the first time, I started believing the stories I heard that there was a QR code. That's all that there was. How do I know that QR code was real? But I didn't remember until I voted the second and the third time, because we had a few runoffs that year, that in fact, when it showed on the screen what it was, that was my actual ballot, and it printed it out with a QR code, but my actual ballot was there. So I could see who I voted for when I stuck it in the ballot reader. And so I thought, well, that's what we have to remind people. It's not that, when your ID was checked, it wasn't checked properly, or that somehow these machines aren't working. There's a paper trace. And so that's why risk limiting audits, which is something we did in Georgia, to count to make sure that actually the QR codes match the paper winners. So if we have to do that to build back trust, we will. It's a lot of effort, but I think it's important. I think we have to shine a light on it, and people have to understand when you go in and vote how those votes are counted.
So Gleaves, you're a historian. How have we gotten to this moment? And how does this moment compare to other sort of crisis moments in American history?
Great question, Jeff. Thank you. But first, I just want to express my appreciation, just as Jeff and Paige have, that so many of you have come to join this conversation. We're going to have a Q&A period afterwards. I want to greet our C-SPAN audience, our Zoom audience, as well as you here in the auditorium, and really appreciate the discussion that I hope we can have moving forward this evening in due course. Just a little background statement here before I directly answer your question. Paige and I were talking about this earlier today. We're involved. You and I are really lucky, fortunate to be involved in work that's more than just a job. I mean, it's kind of regarded as a civilizational mission. We have this opportunity. And we talk a lot at the Ford Presidential Foundation about the fact that ignorance of democracy perhaps is one of the greatest dangers to our democracy. It's a shame when two things happen. It's a shame when people, first of all, don't even believe that they have a voice in our democracy. So why bother? Why would they bother to get involved? Why would they bother to vote if they don't feel that they have a voice in the first place? And that's something that some of the work from our colleagues over at the Presidential Museum have been doing a great job of empowering people so that they have a voice, and then they feel motivated to get involved, engaged. And that begins the long and romantic and wonderful adventure of learning about this democracy and their role in it and their capacity as citizens to make changes that are needed, that respond to the things they need to see happen, to make their lives work better and to make our communities work better. So historically, we have some, of course, very tense times in American history. I don't think this is the worst. Let's just get this out. We had a civil war between 1861 and 1865 in which it did come to blows. Serious decades of squandered opportunities and tension, especially as we moved west. We could not resolve the issue of whether slavery would be taken west as we grew. So how are we growing today? Think about it. There's a little bit of an analogy there. We are opening our borders. We have accepted a much more diverse population than we've ever had in our history, which presents great opportunities and great challenges. But the debates that are around those opportunities do echo some of the things that we heard in the 1850s. The 1840s, when you had a know-nothing party, you had these nativist parties that wanted to just kind of cocoon ourselves as Americans and keep everybody else out and excluded. I don't think that's an option anymore. I think we're at a point in our debate, of course we want controlled immigration, of course. But immigration we're going to have. It's in the nature of our country. So that would be, for example, a historical analogy that I would say comes from previous times. Also, presidential elections. Let me tell you, folks, 1800, between Adams and Jefferson and Aaron Burr, those were so colorful and interesting. I mean, we are boring by comparison. As we say in Texas, I guarantee you, it was a lot more interesting in those days. The tensions. I mean, you had media in those days that were really stoking the fires of, the Federalists hating the Democratic Republicans and vice versa. Lies through the media, lies repeated, with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams supervising the media production of these articles that were blatant lies. So we've had some rough times. The 1960s, which I'm just old enough to remember a bit of. 1960s.
You got a good laugh with that one.
That's right.
Some historian you are.
That's right. That's right. The 1960s were really interesting because what I remember, I had a brother who graduated from the Air Force Academy, and so he was flying F-4s in the Vietnam era. That kind of has a way of riveting your attention when there's a lot of civil unrest, a lot of anti-war protests. That was a period of great protests. The college I went to had Old Main burned down at that period, for example, 1970, where there was a lot of destruction. I mean, we worry about Seattle and Portland and some of the things that have happened. Ladies and gentlemen, I think a lot of you also remember the 1960s, if I could say. And we remember that there was a lot of unrest. We had 3 prominent Americans assassinated, for Pete's sake. Now, a lot of people are predicting the kinds of rough passages that we had then as we enter this new period. But as an historian, there are a lot of factors that came through this. I'll just mention one thing briefly. I think we underestimate the impact, a couple of things, but one I want to just mention right now. That Great Recession of 2008, 2009, that exposed so much of the inequality in our country. The people feeling that you had the finance sector who was kind of, they were manipulating things and ripping off the rest of the country and kind of had these sweetheart deals and no one goes to prison and that kind of thing. I think 2008, 2009, you look at what happened then you see, of course, the Tea Party movement come out. You see Occupy Wall Street, Never the Twain Shall Meet There. Remember how tense that was just 11 years ago. And then after that, of course, you have Bernie Sanders. You have a populist movement, Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right. And remember what happened in Michigan. Everybody in Michigan in 2016 during the primary, on the Democratic side, who won? Bernie Sanders. And Jeff and I were talking about this yesterday. In a fair fight, if the Clintons had not been so much in control of the process, Bernie Sanders would have had a good possibility of being our president. He certainly the nominee in the Democratic Party at that time. And then, of course, Trump coming down the escalator, and our country's never been the same. Populism has arisen in a way, and populism is also not new. Let's be good historians here. Let's put this in perspective. We had populism in '92 with Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. We had populism back in '68 with George Wallace. We had populism back in the 1930s with Huey Long. This is not new. We should not be shocked that this happens. This periodically happens in American history when the average person, the average guy, feels he's gotten the shaft. She's gotten the shaft. It's hard to raise her family. It's hard to keep a job. It's hard to get ahead.
One of the things, if you study populist movements in American history, is they tend to arise when there is great skepticism about the so-called elites. And that's a term that we hear thrown around quite a lot. The elites, and a perception that the elites, whoever they are corrupt, and that they're running this country to their own advantage and not to the advantage or the interests of the average American. what do you think of those kinds of claims? Do you think there is a kind of coterie of elites who are running things to their own interests?
Well, historically, as you point out, populism happens when people feel that they are otherwise not being heard. And it becomes a popular movement, but it's a popular movement against an existing incumbent, usually. And so what populism tends to do is empower people, but only certain people. Only the people that you can plug into that vein, that dopamine that that person needs to feel that their voice is finally being elevated and heard. And so when you put that on, in many cases, rural America, coming from, Atlanta, which is kind of an island of blue and a sea of red, you know what happens outside a big city. And so the populism and the populist movement happens because of that. I would say that, what concerns me about populism is what can be the hollowing out of our institutions and our liberal democracy. Because if the only argument you have is that I don't like what they're doing, then you've started othering people. Like, well, that's the other side does that. And, we're the United States of America. And if you're supposed to have actual liberal democracy where people believe in institutions, they believe in checks and balances and executive power, and our representatives, judicial, and if you start hollowing out those institutions, then you're not left with much. And so I think that's what concerns me most about populism. We see it in Europe. I mean, I certainly saw it in the Netherlands. You see people who are just sort of tapping into this vein of anger, and you have to find ways to talk. At the end of the day, I'm CEO of the Carter Center, but I'm also a wife, a mother, a daughter. There are other places I can have conversations with people that are not just about politics or not just about the Carter Center. And you've got to find ways to have those conversations. Otherwise, you've just entirely othered your neighbor. And I think that's what we're running into right
now. So Gleaves, how do you think that the relationship between Ford and Carter might provide a kind of model for exactly what Paige was just talking about?
Even though Jeff works for me, I swear I did not tell him to pitch a softball.
So I think I'm about due
Thank
for
you.
a raise, yeah.
We're going to have fun with this.
This is going to be
We're
a good
gonna
one,
both
yeah.
have fun. Oh my gosh, where do you begin with this very interesting relationship between Governor Carter and Vice President and then President Ford? I think that they have modeled what so many of us need these days. If you look at a relationship that began a little rough, remember, they were fierce rivals as they, as Governor Carter went through the primary process in the Democratic Party and emerged as the candidate. He sharpened his attacks on President Ford, and some of them, we were just talking earlier tonight. Let's take one example. Let's just get one out of this. Because I'm an historian, I like to pop balloon. I like to pop preconceived notions. Let's take the debate where President Ford, remember where President Ford stumbled and he said, there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. How many of you remember that? And if you go upstairs, and that's one of the beautiful things about Jerry Ford is that every peccadillo, every weakness, everything that showed a vulnerability, it's up there in that museum. And when his cabinet and when people around him would say, why would you have these expressions of your weakness there? He would always say, because history matters. People need to know the truth. We are fallible. So President Carter, of course, would take advantage of that. But let's just say for the record, as a little sidebar here, Governor Carter would take advantage of that. President Ford had recently been to the Vatican and met with Pope Paul VI, and he had also been behind the then Iron Curtain countries. And he had spoken to people in these countries that were directly impacted by the Soviet Empire. What he
There you go.
What he meant to say was that there is no spiritual domination of the Soviet Empire over Eastern Europeans. And of course, he was vindicated by 79, 80, 81, when you had Solidarity, you had Lech Walesa, you had people, the Velvet, the beginning of the Velvet Revolution. This is something that Paige could speak to because she was in Prague in those years, around 1990, 92. We were talking about that earlier. So that's an important correction, or at least adjustment to make. But of course, Governor Carter is going to take advantage of that faux pas. Now, they go through, of course, a very close election. President Ford is down more than 20 points, 25 points in the polling. And in the campaigning, it looks like he doesn't have a chance. He scrapes and claws his way back, to, at one point, one Gallup poll actually shows him with a lead like a week before the election. Alas, he did not have enough time because those polls were going back and forth. And on Tuesday, when they voted, Governor Carter won. And from that point on, Governor Carter was very, very gracious. Do you want a lump in your throat if you're feeling a little emotionally flat right now? Let me tell you what will give you a lump in your throat. You go upstairs, and there are 3 places where Governor Carter, now President Carter, speaks about his friend Jerry Ford. And one of the most famous, of course, is on January 20th, 1977, when President Carter has been sworn in and he's now giving his inaugural address. And one of the first things he does is he says, I want to thank my predecessor, President Ford, for doing so much to heal our land. He stops his inaugural address. You can see this upstairs. He stops the inaugural address. He pivots. President Ford stands. They shake hands in one of the most beautiful moments in our lifetime. And President Ford thanks him. Former President Ford thanks him, sits back down. And you can see Carter is sort of collecting himself. Now fast forward to 2007. Fast forward to the moment when President Carter is giving the eulogy for his friend. And President Carter, at sort of the climax of the eulogy, says, I cannot think of a better way to talk about my friend Jerry than to repeat the words that I repeated so many decades ago. I want to thank. Carter clutches. You can tell he's fighting. He says, I want to thank my friend for doing all he did to heal our land. This iteration is really what a great political friendship is about. President Carter said, this may be your line, Paige, but I love this line. President Carter and President Ford were on stage together and they were asked about their friendship. And President Carter said, of all the former presidents, we have the best friendship of any of them, including Adams and Jefferson. Look at what they overcame. How did this happen? Paige can speak beautifully to this as well. But it happened because at the core of both of these human beings was a heart of gold, a sterling character, unshakable integrity, a sense of fair dealing and decency, and integrity that would take them through all their public life and their private lives. And this is what allowed them to become friends. They knew they could trust each other. There's another little display up there, and I know you've seen it. But it's about the post-presidency, and President Carter is interviewed, and we have the interview, and it's, go to this museum, see it up there. Joel and Morel and Brooke will give you a first-class tour. And President Carter is asked, well, did you have any serious differences with President Ford? President Carter said, no, fundamentally, I don't have any major disagreements with any decision President Ford made as president. And this helps explain. President Ford was known to deregulate, the economy. The federal government had a lot of rules and regulations back in the early and mid-'70s, and he started to deregulate. Carter picked right up. And then Reagan became president and took all the credit. But the deregulation actually started Ford and Carter.
Upstairs.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a number of things where President Carter so respects, and President Carter is keeping President Ford in all the briefings, you know, the monthly briefings. In fact, he said to the former president, whenever you're in Washington, D.C., and President Ford would go back to Washington a lot to speak and teach in the classroom, and also he was a member of American Enterprise Institute. Whenever you're back, you're welcome to have lunch with me in the White House at any time. And this wonderful friendship arose. I think here I want Paige to pick it up because she can tell the next installment of an airplane trip and what happened in the post-presidency and so forth.
Right. Well, since to bring this back to modern day, you know, we're in the middle of debate season. So it's tonight, tomorrow night, I can't remember, tonight. So when you go home, if you watch it having been taped or if you're watching it, remember that President Carter, or Governor Carter, and President Ford, when they were on stage, Governor Carter always said, "My distinguished opponent's view is," and he always said the words, "my distinguished opponents." That was, I mean, that was the civility between them, even when they were running against each other. And so that just gives you a basis for understanding when two men are running for the highest office in the land, there's a way to do it with civility. And President Carter tells an interesting story that when Anwar Sadat died, President Carter, President Ford, and President Nixon were on the plane together to go to the funeral. And he said it was incredibly awkward. and he said, but he and President Ford started talking, and hours went by, and they didn't stop. And they just continued the conversation. And from that point on, 1983, on, they did 25 events together. President Carter was here, President Ford was down in Atlanta, and it's because they respected each other and they knew that their post-presidencies were going to, what defined them was also very much going to be their post-presidencies. They both had fairly limited terms, and so I think that that is, I joked with Gleaves because when I came, I was here last summer, and we hadn't met yet, and a couple of my colleagues were with me, and I said, well, let's run across to the museum. I'd really like to see the Ford Museum. So I dropped my card at the front and said, if Gleaves Whitney is here, please let him know the CEO of the Carter Center is here. So we started making our way through, and we stopped right at the election, and I was like, then Gleaves found me, and we got swept away and started talking. So I went back today so I could see what happened after the election. I mean, you know, spoiler alert, I kind of knew, but not entirely. And to have an opportunity to see also what President Ford did and what he put forward as his persona was just very much in line with what President Carter did. You know, we were joking earlier, you were talking about how President Ford grew up and, you know, impoverished, you know, a mother who ran away from her husband, his father, which, you know, you just didn't do back then. And I was like, yeah, but my guy was a peanut farmer. Like, so he didn't wear shoes until he was 8 years old. So you realize they both came from very similar backgrounds of villages, small towns, and then they had the highest office in the land, and they took that to mean something after they left office. And that's, so we're trying to emulate that, and I wish we could see a little bit more of that in America right now. But they really set a standard that we're continuing to try to live up to. You need.
We are committed to that, and our two institutions are committed to that, and this is why, you know, we signed on to a wonderful initiative of the Carter Center for candidate principles for integrity, good elections, elections of integrity, fair elections. And Paige can address that more, but I do want to say about that plane trip, it was awkward until Nixon left that part. Once Nixon left, I mean...
I didn't want to cast aspersions, but yes.
Once Nixon left the seating area where Presidents Ford and Carter were, then everything calmed down and they could resume because Nixon was kind of dominating and talking about foreign policy and all that kind of stuff. But the other thing that we need to say here, that in that friendship that was forged were also so many commonalities that they discovered about each other. I mean, just look at even at their family structure. You know, 3 boys and 1 girl, both of them, service in the Navy. You know, they had a whole lot of things in common that they took pride in. I mean, the Fords were very involved in their Episcopalian church. The Carters, of course, were very involved in their Southern Baptist church. They just enjoyed a lot of the same things together. They connected as people. And that also meant that Betty and Rosalynn, the first ladies, connected. And everybody in this room, of course, knows Betty's story, about, first of all, the breast cancer and the revolution she achieved in women's history, almost single-handedly in the fall of 1974, when she made it safe for women in our society to talk about breast cancer at the dinner table. It was a taboo subject in public and a lot of awkwardness at the dinner table about this. Well, after Betty Ford and her interviews, 60 Minutes and Newsweek, cover stories, this country changed in the blink of an eye. And then the other thing was, of course, Mrs. Carter was both as the First Lady of Georgia and as the First Lady of the United States, was interested in the issues of people with mental health problems, disease, and struggles. And of course, then during the Carter administration, it came out that Mrs. Ford had these addictions. And that was the second thing. All of a sudden she made it possible for people, for families. Think of the families that needed to talk about the addictions that were destroying their families. Think of all the families that were changed because now there could be an honest conversation about these things. Again, Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Carter, I think, found each other in that conversation, and they became very close. And that's why they'd go back and forth. They always had something to work on and talk about.
And the mental health issues, much like addiction, as this country's gone through opioid crisis, people talk about that now, but they weren't. 40 years ago, that was not a conversation. The same thing with mental illness. When people are having a mental health crisis, none of us became, she worked so hard to destigmatize the conversation, but it wasn't until COVID where it really became destigmatized because parents could talk about it when their children were going through it, when parents were going through it, when elderly were going through it. And so I think both of them were trailblazers in a way that just in the 21st century, we're now seeing these are conversations you can have at the dinner table and are conversations that were supported. Both men had very strong wives. They also both had very strong mothers. And I think that conversation was something that was allowed to happen in their households that weren't necessarily allowed in my grandparents' or my parents' household at the time. So
I think that's a really good description of how their friendship evolved and why it evolved the way it did. But politics is about something different than friendship. So you kind of drew our attention to things that they already had in common. But politics in some ways is about discovering goods that you can pursue in common with each other. And I think that for a lot of people, that seems to be what's missing in our political moment is finding people on both sides of the aisle who are willing to identify goods that could be pursued in common with each other. Do you think that the world was different for them back then, where they could find those kinds of things that transcended just party interest or self-interest? Or has our moment kind of devolved in just this conflict and conflicting ideas of what is good and what is right?
That's a tough one because I think that day and age was very different than where we are now. And with social media and people's ability to sort of exist in an echo chamber now of what they want to hear, you didn't have that back in the 70s and 80s. You picked up the newspaper, you talked to your neighbor, but you weren't bombarded constantly with, have you seen this story, either by email or Facebook or news? And so their commonality existed because we had limited bandwidth to the information that we had. And so fact, was not fiction. It was really, facts were facts, and everyone accepted the facts for what was presented to them. But now there's so many facts out there that it's hard to tell what is fact and what's fiction. So I think, back to these conversations about being able to pick up the phone and call someone and have a conversation versus just forwarding an email or just click activism where you're saying, oh, this is an interesting issue. I want to make sure I get involved in that and sign up for this listserv or sign up for this, event. Well, once that happens, those are all the events you're going to hear moving forward. You're not going to hear anything on the other side. And so to have the commonality of whether, breast cancer, addiction, mental health, you find a weakness and then you talk about it together as opposed to finding a weakness and just digging in. So I think it's just a hard time to compare right now because we listen to what we listen to. It's part of the joys of being so socially connected and able to reach out to people. It comes with, it's a curse as well.
I so agree with that. Paige, I think a lot about how our society has changed because of social media. My wife, Mary Eileen, has been in media for 40 years. It's her whole career. We talk about this kind of thing a lot at the dinner table. And if you look at, say, a bell curve of our society, and, sort of the hump of the bell, the center axis there, we're sort of where most people are. But look at the tails and what has happened. If you look at the surveys of what has happened to our population, you want short tails on the bell curve. That means people who are way out on the extremes. You want them really short. And what has happened in the last 10, 15 years, statistically, is that those tails have gotten really long. And that means we have extremists out there that are virtually unreachable. And why did this happen? Because extremists now have a voice through social media, as you just said, that no extremists in human history have had before. Now that's sort of the news bulletin for this historian about something that is unprecedented. Think about that. Extremists were just the quaint, uncle at your, at your Thanksgiving dinner and didn't do much harm because everybody thought, that's Uncle Ted and he's just, being Uncle Ted. Whereas now they can reach millions of people. And so I like to look at our work, what you're doing at the Carter and what we're doing at the Ford, is if you look at that hump, and you got the tail, we're not going to reach those folks on the left and the right at the extremes. But there is a zone in there. It's not in the heart of the bell, but it's sort of on the margins, but not out there at the tails. Those are the Americans who are worth reaching and saving and pulling in to the norms of our culture, to the amazing history that we have, the redemptive country that we have, to find that they do have a voice that counts, and the election integrity that you all have done so much good work on, to fight for that and believe in it. So that's my little sociology lecture tonight. I just think that, we have to be clear about where we do have agency and make a difference and bring those folks in the margins in.
So your metaphor suggests that there is still a rather large consensus among the population in this country that transcends a lot of the political divisions. What's the nature of that consensus? I mean, if you think about there being this kind of middle in the country, what are the things that seem to matter to people that they agree on?
Sadly, I think they agree to disagree more than anything else that's out there right now. The political polarization just has as we said, has othered the other side. So again, as I said, when I take it as I'm CEO, but I'm also a wife, a mother, a daughter. There are conversations. I have kids in school. You can find space where you can have that conversation. I think at the end of the day, everyone's voting their pocketbook. They're concerned about whether it's their taxes, whether it's Medicare, whether it's Social Security. People are going to vote that. And so how do you have a conversation around that? Well, the politicians don't. They just bury that. And it becomes a non-policy discussion. And so, so they find areas that are sort of on the extremes. I heard that there were little men in voting, in the voting boxes, changing my vote. And so part of what this candidate principles that we are working on together, and you can look it up, it's actually called principledcandidates.org. And you can see having candidates say that they're going to adhere to the civility of the election, that regardless who wins, they can pursue legal, battles up until a certain point, but they're going to adhere to the results. And we had this in Georgia when you had Stacey Abrams, who did not necessarily concede the election, but she signed the candidate principles and Brian Kemp signed it. So we knew when that election happened, we would be able to say they signed it. And Brad Raffensperger, our Secretary of State, and B. Wynn signed it. We had 60 candidates throughout the U.S. And that was just when we launched kind of right before the election. And now we're going full on with Ford, with the Carter Center, with the Baker Institute, with the McCain Institute. All of this is to say we want to hold, as we said in our op-ed, or on CNN op-ed we did last year, people want their politicians to be held accountable to being adults. And so I think as issues come out, they will get raised during this campaign season, but it's watching for the tail wagging the dog. I want to get to that squishy middle, like, again, not straight in the middle, but on the sides, because there are people who voted one way in the last election and won't do that again, and vice versa, people who have switched sides. Just sharing facts, educating people, making sure they understand about their vote, and I don't know if you were going to ask about voting, bigger voting issues, but we have 10,000 election jurisdictions in the United States, 10,000. And in Georgia itself, we have 159 counties, second only to Texas, and 159 counties that have different election rules. Some close at 7, some close at 6, some have drop boxes, some don't. It is really, besides how you vote with the actual ballot when you walk in, all the systems are the same, but people feel disenfranchised if they can't access it because, when I was in Macon, I voted this way, and I could vote after work up until 7 o'clock, but apparently you can't do that in Savannah. And so when we look at, it's wonderful that it's decentralized and states have the ability to do it, but it's also a curse because without that centralization, you don't have control. And in 40 countries that we work in, there's a central election commission. So you know when people are misbehaving, you know who to blame, and you know that an election commission is going to hold them accountable. That's just not the way it works in the U.S. And so good news is you can't hack every election across the United States at the same time because they're all so different. The bad news is some of them can get hacked, and they could be the important ones, and people can't vote as easily as they should be able to. And so those are things that we have to actually pull together and make sure people understand how you vote in your neighborhood, how that happens, how your voice can be heard.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Just the mechanics of holding an election. And in the United States, the time, place, and manner of elections is dictated by the states, not by the federal government. So you'd have to have a constitutional amendment to change something like that. So given the unlikelihood that there will ever be a constitutional amendment on that, how would the Carter Center in their actions kind of operate in all these different jurisdictions that you have to operate with? I mean, how could you possibly cover all that territory?
Well, I think President Carter and President Ford started together with the Federal Election Commission, the Federal Election Reform Commission, and they came up with some suggestions. And so this was 2004, I think. And so HAVA, Help America Vote Act, HAVA, HAVA Act, was put in place. But it took 18 years before they actually started putting federal funding into it. And so the reality is that states can't necessarily afford to do all of this on their own. And so, there's 7 states that don't even have a civics curriculum in the United States. So if you're starting at the lowest level of elementary school students and there's no required civics curriculum, and then the state only puts in 5 cents per student for civics, 50 cents per student for STEM, and STEM is important, but at the end of the day, 5 cents for civics is not going to have you raising citizens who understand how voting works or understands how democracy works. So when they get to voting age, and Arizona, I'll use that as an example, when in Maricopa County, people heard about that, The cyber ninjas came in because they wanted to recount the ballots. You know, people were worried about like what happened in Arizona. They took all the machines off property out of Maricopa County's, election facility to redo the votes and to recount them. Well, now Maricopa County can't use those machines anymore because they've been out, they went outside the building. No one knows what might have happened. They've got millions of dollars now that Maricopa residents are going to have to pay to actually bring those machines, to get new machines that are safe and secure. So when you've got a state that's responsible for running its own elections and you don't have the federal funds, between 2018 and 2022, $1.3 billion in federal funds was pushed into the elections because it was COVID, because they were worried about, did the Russians hack the 2016 election? So $1.3 billion. Between 2022 and 2024, they're only putting $70 million in. So where does that leave? That leaves dark money coming in to try to help elections. But if the federal government's not going to take responsibility for it, which is, again, what President Ford and President Carter had suggested in 2004, how's this going to get paid for? So it comes down to the state budget. State has to decide between education and voting. It comes down to dark money, who's paying for money to go in to train election administrators and election officials. We have money to do that, but then we've gotten vilified in the press that, we're using Chinese spies to train people how to do elections in Fulton County. So it's worrisome to figure out how you run an election in a way that the states have control, but they're also supported by the feds.
Long-standing structural issues, I think, are quite concerning because we don't seem to be able to get a handle on just a couple of things. President Ford, in interviews, and it was after 2000, well, it was when he was working on HAVA, he would say the two things that rip off the American voter are gerrymandering and money overwhelming congressional districts from the outside, which is McCain-Feingold, right? That would be to account for the latter.
Yep.
But the former, the gerrymandering, think about it. President Ford liked to think of our country as having balanced populations in every congressional district so that the voters would hear a full airing of the issues. Think about it, if the safe seats just keep growing and growing, which is what has happened in our democracy, then that means more and more Americans have sorted themselves, likely, and they are not hearing the full debate. And that really does rip off the voter because the voter then doesn't really have a choice. I mean, in California, you might have, 20 million people, say 25 million people who are voting, and 13 million are voting for one candidate, 12 million maybe are voting for the other, but they don't hear the full debate. And that is what hurts them. And President Ford was perennially worried about that. And we've got to change our habits in this country structurally.
Well, I think we'd like to have some time for the audience to ask questions as well. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we'll bring you a microphone so that people on Zoom can hear you as well.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring discussion. So inspiring that remembering the 60s, I get even teary when you talk about it. But it's not enough to just go back and say things were better, or it's not enough to go back and say things used to be worse. Where's the hope today in our current situation?
Still my last question, by the way.
I was about to say, we're going to try to end on something hopeful. I'll say the hope is that people now care about democracy and they care about voting. We have had more people voting, more younger voters coming out because they know that their voice will be heard. So the fact that people care about this, I think, is very important. I'll also say, and Ambassador Susan Paige, who's here from University of Michigan, is on our board. When she was ambassador, she said she had this wonderful comment she made at July 4th overseas. She said, even though our democracy is self-evident, it is not necessarily self-enforcing. And so we can't take advantage of what we have we actually have to participate in it. And I think people are realizing that now, and that's great. You don't talk to a high schooler who doesn't think, yeah, I should vote. I mean, there's climate, you're killing the world. I mean, usually it's my kids telling me everything that we've done wrong. My generation is ruining the world for them, but it means that they're going to get out and participate, and so that's my.
And we've been really lucky, Professor Kenshi, in this community to have a number of members in our board of trustees here at the foundation who are committed to education. I'm thinking of people like Doug DeVos, Peter Secchia, Hank Meyer, who's in the audience, others who are really concerned. They do understand that one of the greatest threats to democracy is ignorance of democracy, or not having a voice in that democracy. So I'm proud of the efforts of my predecessors here at the Ford Presidential Foundation, who've done so much to bring 10, 12,000 kids a year through our museum and make sure that they are aware of how our democracy works, yes, the mechanics, but more importantly, that it's people at the end of the day, people of character at the end of the day, that makes a democracy and the leadership necessary to be part of that democracy work. So I have a lot of hope in the rising generation, whether it's through our DeVos Learning Center and our curricula there, whether it's through the Ford Leadership Forum. Jeff is the director of that effort for the college students and young professionals. And then the continuing education. You all are lifelong learners. You will talk to your grandkids. You'll talk to your neighbors. I see the hope right here. So, did I flatter you enough?
If I could abuse my position here just briefly to address your question, it goes back to something Gleaves was talking about earlier. Democracies are inherently fragile systems of government. They're incredibly difficult to operate, make, and run. But precisely because they're fragile, they're also resilient. And if you look at American history, you'll see all these periods of crisis, but those periods of crisis always end up generating this real resiliency in the public. And so I still have hope in the resiliency of America and Americans. I think that we have a nasty habit of bouncing back from our own mistakes.
Just to address the issue of hope that you spoke to, in our own state of Michigan, you may not be aware of, Paige, we've, in the last 5 years, largely based on grassroots efforts which started in the Grand Rapids area, created an independent redistricting commission for our legislative districts in the state. And as a result of those efforts, our legislature now more closely reflects the Democratic, Republican divide in our state than it had in the past when gerrymandering was still the rule of the day.
One thing on that, because gerrymandering is, the United States is so interesting because our election officials, most of our election officials are actually elected to office. So they're partisan to begin with from the very beginning. So you've got secretaries of state that are Republican or Democrats, but they have also done a very nonpartisan job on the elections themselves. I mean, some of the most outspoken about the safety and security of the 2020 election were Republicans in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, saying, this is how the vote went. In Arizona, we saw people speaking out. But gerrymandering is something that 2/3 of Americans, in a poll, 2/3 of Americans don't believe in political processes on redistricting. But 50% of Americans don't understand how else redistricting can be done. So I think Michigan's done it in a really interesting way that is different than North Carolina is undertaking, for example, now. So I think there are models that can be used, and I would like to see the U.S. learn from itself. So.
First of all, I thank you for you guys coming. And second thing is I have a question. I am Vietnamese American, immigrated here 30 years ago. So basically, I just want to say democracy is dead now. Please wake up, America. I run away communist, and I come in here for freedom, but the freedom dead now because the election is rigged. You can sit down there and say how well security. You know, it's not security because it's rigged.
Is there a question for our panelists?
I have a question.
Okay, please state the question.
Yes. So you believe is that the election secure. Can you tell me why the ballots is underneath of the table in Georgia and take out in the suitcase? And why in Detroit they not let the people come in and they cover? And why California is like 100,000 fake ballots? It's everywhere.
Thank you for your question.
So can you tell it?
I think if you read about those instances that you've mentioned, you'll find that in certain places it looks nefarious. But if you actually watch the entire video, you can see those were not hidden ballots. So it's hard, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you afterwards. But I know that I believe in what you saw and what you believe in. It's just something different than the courts have believed or what I've seen. But I'm happy to talk to you afterwards.
And I'd just add, I think there have been, correct me if I'm wrong, 65 court cases which have sort of vindicated that the system worked. And recounts. That's not to say that there aren't problems, and it's not to say that there is some fraud, but the scale of the fraud was not great enough, according to these court cases, to have overturned an election.
Yeah. There were 13 improperly cast ballots that came out of the Georgia election, and that's what after 3 recounts. So, there's human mistake that happens. So, next question.
I hear the term democracy being used over and over again, but rarely the term republic. And I was always taught that the United States was a republic, not a democracy. And I wonder if the panel could address that and clarify that for us.
I love that question. That's an excellent question because it is historically accurate. Our founders actually were afraid of democracy, and so they contained the democratic element. If you look at sort of the nature of constitutions, they can either have a monarchical or authoritarian element, they can have an aristocratic element, they can have a democratic element. And our more monarchical element, they gave in Article 2 of the Constitution, they gave the presidency a little bit more power than they had originally entered the debates because they counted on George Washington being the president. Frankly, it came down to a character issue of George Washington. They gave the more aristocratic element to the Supreme Court, the Senate, the 6-year terms, and they contained the democratic element in the House of Representatives. So you had a mixed form of government, a mixed constitution in which all of the interests that would arise in these different elements would counter each other. And that was a Republican form of government. Also, then you add the representative element, because remember, so many republics in the ancient world were much smaller. And as a result of that, people could, go and talk to each other from far-flung areas when riding a horse was, what was far-flung. Whereas once you got to the United States in the modern era, the area covered is so huge, you have to have representative government in this republic, this constitutional. In fact, we are a constitutional republic, technically. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for a great question.
That's a good answer.
But you know what? The political philosopher up here is Herr Dr. Professor Polet.
Yeah, here it is. Yeah. No, it's a complicated story because that was really the debate, whether we were actually creating a Republican form of government or not. And the critics of the Constitution criticized the document for not being sufficiently Republican. And the argument you can see, boy, here, be careful what you wish for. In Federalist 9, Hamilton argues that the big innovation in American politics is in the science of representation, that they understand how representation works. And when you think about it, that's an enormous innovation in political life, that you have representative government. And then Madison argues in Federalist 10 that that system of representation requires an extended republic. Because the critics of the Constitution saying this can only work on a small scale. And Madison says, yeah, but if you look at all these republics in the past, his phrase is, they are as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths. And so that's what he's trying to avoid, and he thinks the way to avoid that is to extend the government over greater territory and more people, a greater population, and then solve the problems through a system of representation.
I have nothing to add on the Federalist Papers unless it was sung in Hamilton. So, my hope is that maybe the next generation, Lin-Manuel will do a whole Federalist Papers so we learn all of that.
Just got to say, speaking of Hamilton, speaking of the Federalist Papers, here's your homework assignment. I hope everybody in this room goes home and reads a very short Federalist paper, Federalist 1, written by Hamilton, where Hamilton talks about the virtue of moderation. It's an excellent, really little overview of how our constitutional republic should work, and it sets the stage for the following 84 Federalist Papers. But moderation should be the guiding principle, that's right, of the Federalist Papers and of the discussions that are going to arise around this Constitution, how we're going to live together peaceably. That's a homework assignment. I'm going to ask you next time.
Sorry? The other part of your homework assignment is apparently to learn something about this Taylor Swift person. She exists in Beyonce. I believe we have, what time is it? I don't know. Yeah, in the back there, Regan, if you want to bring. Microphone, yeah.
I worked at polling places for a number of years as the chairperson, and I always looked for absentee ballots as being the place where you could make mischief. And I think that people keep talking about recounts when the issue seemed to me to be that people who shouldn't have been able to vote might have voted, and that the mischief was in last-minute rule changes, and nobody seems to address that. Recounts seem to be ridiculous after a while, but those switches bothered me.
I think switching mid-election season is something that is difficult. So let me give you just anecdotally what I saw, because when the Carter Center was asked to be the nonpartisan observer in the Georgia elections in 2020, I was in Fannin County, which was won by Trump by 76%. I was in Fulton County, which is the largest county in Georgia, and DeKalb County, the second largest county. So I watched the recounts in each of these places. One of the things with the absentee ballot, so being in this small county in Fannin, Georgia, North Georgia, I watched them counting the absentee ballots because there was a Democrat and a Republican sitting at a table, which I'm sure y'all had to hear, and they would hold up the ballot and they would look because someone always would write in Pence for president, or the absentee ballots looked a little different. And so there always had to be a discussion between the two, what was intended by this. But the difference is that in Georgia, when the absentee ballots were mailed in, don't forget, we all have a secret ballot, and you don't want your personal information being there. So it was the Georgia Bureau of Investigation that would actually look at the signature on the envelope, open, and then if the signature was verified, they would open the envelope would go one place, and the absentee ballot would go another place, so it could be counted. But you did separate it. So then there was the question of, I want to see signatures. And so that became the rally cry of, how do we know the signatures were valid? How do we know that these people could really vote? Well, all those envelopes were kept separately by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, so you could determine that everyone who was counted here actually had a matching signature. And so I think the signature match is a big deal. I think whether or not someone was actually registered at that address with that signature is done ahead of time, and then the votes are counted. So when you have a recount, you're looking at it separately. But I think the rule changes are very difficult. But I know in Georgia, our absentee ballot, even during COVID, was not necessarily that high that it would have, could have changed the election if anything funny had happened. But I watched how these things were counted specifically. And yeah, we can have that conversation later. Let's get to some of the other questions.
I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists and thank Paige so much for coming to Grand Rapids. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this event tonight. If you are not a friend of Ford and on our mailing list, you should definitely consider becoming a friend of Ford. And if you have a friend who is not a friend of Ford, make that friend a friend of Ford as well. We have a great year of programming coming up. As I mentioned, on September 8 and 9, is that right? We have the Vice Presidency Conference. We have the exhibit on the Vice Presidency that's going up on, it's open already. Okay, I'm obviously on top of things. And on October 4th, the foundation has our next event here in the auditorium with Wayman Britt, who's on our Board of Trustees, and Bob Woodson from the Woodson Center in Washington, D.C., who was here last year as well. So we hope to see you at all those events. And again, thank you so much for coming out. Yeah.